Jalen was just playing with his basketball ball in a quiet neighborhood of Connecticut, enjoying an ordinary day. But his fun was interrupted when a woman accused him of invading his house. Unknowingly, she had just made a mistake that would change everything to her and to the neighborhood in ways she would never imagine. Jalen Williams, a 12-year-old boy, was brilliant, polite, and full of energy. He had recently moved to the neighborhood with his mother, seeking a new life in a quieter place. Jalen was passionate about basketball, and his days were filled with dribbles and attempts to throw, always with a smile on his face. Despite his optimistic and friendly nature, he carried a deep sensitivity resulting from the difficult experiences he had lived in his life, including moments of discrimination. Before moving to the new neighborhood, Jalen lived in a busier area where his life was immersed in sounds, people, and the constant pressure of the big city. His mother, Monique, has always encouraged him to be independent, but change to a quieter place brought him new challenges. At 12, Jalen was not afraid to start over, but he was lost in a sea of new faces and unknown spaces. His new neighborhood seemed so calm, but at the same time, he had a certain distance between him and the other children at school. The biggest challenge for Jalen was the feeling of being estranged. He was not used to the long, quiet streets and the way other neighbors looked at each other. There was something strange in everyday interactions, as if it were not totally accepted. The children of his new school were kind on the surface, but he noticed the stealthy eyes, the laughs on the corners, and sometimes hesitation in words. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but over time, it was clear that his skin color made him a target. Even without explicit words being said, basketball was its refuge. Whenever he felt that the world around him did not understand him, the basketball court was there to welcome him. He didn't care what they thought of him when he dribbled and gave his shots next to his home. For him, the basketball ball represented more than a simple sport. It was the only way to feel that it was in control, to block the voices of insecurity and doubt. On the other hand, Margaret Whitmore, in his 50s, was an imposing woman and a severe look, shaped by years of a comfortable and conservative life. She was proud to be a respected figure in the community, always seeking to maintain a flawless image and rigid control over her environment. Although it seemed safe and reliable on the outside, his worldview was strongly influenced by fears and rooted assumptions, often distorted by personal experiences and a lack of empathy with those who were different from it. She and her husband Harold had moved to the neighborhood for over 20 years, and since then she has become one of the central figures of the community. As the wife of a successful lawyer and mother of 2 children, Margaret cultivated the image of a woman with her feet on the ground, focused on the safety and welfare of her family. She was proud of her role as a guardian of the neighborhood, always ready to help keep things in order. But behind this facade of respect and control, there was a deep fear story that Margaret carried. During her youth, she experienced a traumatic experience she could never overcome. She was robbed in her own home, something that, for her, was the worst possible scenario. That experience made her marked, and since then, the fear of the unknown, of imminent danger, has always been present. The fear of being a victim again was so deep that she was beginning to see threats where there was not. This fear shaped her vision of security, who was dangerous and who was not, and how she reacted when something unusual happened. It was a sunny afternoon in Connecticut, with the clear and blue sky, cloudless in sight. The soft heat of the sun spread over the houses, heating the gardens well cared for, where the flowers began to bloom, coloring the sidewalks with shades of red, yellow, and purple. The sound of birds singing in the distance mixed with the quiet murmur of the leaves shaking in the wind. The street was calm, totally silent, but the tranquility of the neighborhood was broken by Jamal. He was alone, dribbling his basketball ball in front of his house, as he used to do whenever the afternoon extended. But then something simple happened. The ball jumped from his dominion and rolled toward the backyard of a neighbor. Jalen followed her quickly, laughing at himself, not imagining what was coming. Arriving around the fence, he stopped and looked around. No sound, no figure in sight. With a smile, he approached the backyard and called in a soft voice, "Sorry, my ball was here. Can I take it? Silence. He hesitated for a moment. I didn't want to cause problems, but it seemed safe. So, without thinking, he entered the ground in search of his lost ball. But across the street, a window opened and a figure watched carefully. Margaret Whitmore, a lady with sharp eyes like blades, was there, watching every movement of the boy. For her, it wasn't just a child looking for a ball. No, something was wrong. Something seemed out of place. She frowned, a severe expression taking over her face. His heart accelerated and his mind began to make quick assumptions. Who is he? What are you doing in my backyard? Anxiety has become an impetuous decision. Without wasting time, she took the phone and dialed the police number. Hello, police? There is a black boy in my backyard. He is causing problems. His voice was cold, controlled. He looked suspicious. Come soon. Meanwhile, Jalen was distracted with the ball, ready to return to his street when a distant sound cut the air. Sirens. Suddenly, they were closer. Before I could sue what was happening, the sound of the patrol wheels echoed in his ears. He turned, still confused, and saw the police car quickly approaching. The police descended with serious expressions, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. Jalen felt a shiver travel his spine, the adrenaline rising. What was happening? Why were they there? The officers approached, and a firm voice cut silence. What are you doing here, boy? Jalen squeezed the basketball ball against his chest, trying to keep his calm. I was just catching my ball, he answered, his voice low and hesitant. But before he could explain more, a shadow projected himself over him. Margaret appeared at the door, pointing directly to the boy. His voice was now higher, full of accusation. It's him, the boy. He has been here all day, stirring my backyard. She looked at the police without hesitation. He doesn't belong to this neighborhood. I don't know what he's doing here, but it's not right. Jalen felt the weight of her words falling upon him like a stone, which was just a childish mistake, a ball rolling to the wrong place. Now it was becoming something much bigger, something he couldn't understand. Fear grew inside him, but he remained firm, squeezing the ball as if it were his only connection with normality. The police exchanged quick looks, trying to decipher what was going on. Their faces were impenetrable, as if they were trying to understand what exactly was at stake here. One of them, the highest, turned to Jalen with a calm but hard expression. Son, he started, the serious voice, is this true? Are you invading her backyard? Jalen looked at the floor. His mind was 1,000 an hour. Basketball was still tight against his chest, his hands shaking slightly. I wasn't invading, he answered with an almost inaudible voice, as if he wanted to hide within his own words. I was just taking my ball. She rolled her backyard. Margaret, with his arms crossed and firm expression, wasted no time to interrupt him. Of course, she replied sarcastically, her sharp voice. This is always what they say. She looked with disdain to Jalen, as if he were just part of a pattern she already knew well. It starts with a ball, she continued, clear contempt in her speech. And before you realize, they are out there, invading houses, looking for something to steal. Her words hit Jalen as a punch in the stomach. His body shuddered, and his panic-filled eyes frantically moved, looking for some sign of empathy in the faces of the police or the neighbors who watched their windows. But there was no mercy. They were all looking at him, as if he were guilty of something he didn't even understand. His chest squeezed, and he tried to open his mouth, but the words simply did not leave. He felt the weight of the eyes on him, the growing pressure, the fear, while the sirens still echoed in the background. The older policeman frowned, watching Jalen with an expression that was neither understanding nor judgment, just doubt. He approached even closer. Why didn't you stay in your own backyard? He asked, his voice firm but with a tip of confusion. Jalen blinked, not understanding well what was wrong with the question. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just trying to get his ball. Before Jalen could try to explain, Margaret intruded again, her proud and safe posture of himself. I told you, she stated with a definitive tone, like a sentence. I knew he was plotting something. But Jalen was not plotting anything. He was just a boy, without malice, who loved basketball and was being treated like a criminal. The silence stopped for a moment, heavy, until the policeman, not knowing what to do, turned to him with a decision made. You'll have to come with us, he said, the voice with no room for argument. Let's take you to an interrogation." Jalen felt the fear freeze his words. He did not argue, did not resist. His hands still grabbing basketball, he stepped back, feeling the pressure of his eyes and anguish growing in his chest. But before he could be led, he turned to the policeman, his voice shaking, breaking the silence with a simple request. "Can I call my mother?" Margaret, who seemed pleased with the course of things, didn't even realize the weight of the words to come. The policeman, in turn, did not know what was about to happen. What he didn't know, and what Margaret would never imagine, is that Jalen's mother wasn't any figure. She was not just a mother worried about her son. She was Governor Monique Williams, one of the most powerful women in the state. The telephone played urgently at the office of Governor Monique Williams. When she answered, her son Jalen's shaky voice made her heart freeze. She didn't need more explanations. In seconds, she'd already made a call, then another, and before she could sue everything, her black SUV fleet was accelerating along the road, her flashing lights and roaring engines as they crossed the quiet neighborhood. The sirens cut the air. Not one, not two, but an entire row of imposing vehicles approaching with an overwhelming force. The street, once serene, was being invaded by the storm. Margaret Whitmore, still standing near his backyard, turned, confused by the growing agitation. She had no idea what was coming, and it was about to find out. The train rolled down the street, stopping in front of Margaret's house. The doors opened, and with a firm posture, Governor Monique Williams left, her imposing presence stealing everyone's attention. She didn't hurry. There was no need. His name was an authority by itself. She stood out in the crowd, and there was no way to ignore her. Margaret, who once felt holding in his position, was now about to understand the magnitude of the mistake he had made. She had thought she was dealing with a simple case of an invasion. How could she know that the boy he had accused was the son of the most powerful woman in the state? Monique's eyes traveled the scene with a cold calm, watching the police, the curious neighbors, and finally focusing on Jalen. She studied him for a moment, his impossible expression to decipher. Then finally his voice, soft but firm, cut the air. "What is happening here?" The officers hesitated, exchanging uncomfortable glances. One of them, with a slight choke in his throat, finally answered, trying to keep his composure before the governor. "Governor Carter, lady, we were called to a suspicious activity report. This young man was seen in private property." Monique slowly turned her head to Margaret, and her voice was loaded with a question that no one wanted to answer. "And did you make this report?" Margaret, still stunned and trying to recover the composure, nodded, his voice lower than before. "Yes, I saw him in my backyard. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing, so I called the police. I thought it was the right thing to do." Monique did not respond immediately. The silence between them became heavy, while the governor's eyes never left Margaret. The tension was palpable, and everyone seemed aware that they were on the brink of something big. Finally, Monique turned to the police, her now even more imposing posture. "This is Jalen Williams, my son," she said, her sharp voice, as if she was challenging everyone to question the legitimacy of her word. She then looked straight at the police. "And what evidence do you have to suggest that he was doing something suspicious?" The police looked at each other, uncomfortable with the situation they were witnessing. It was clear that before the governor, they were unanswered for the empty accusations that had been made. Monique looked at Jalen, her expression softening for a brief moment, and she gave her a little nod. When she turned her eyes to Margaret, her voice was firm but loaded with a tone of unbelief. "So a 12-year-old boy goes to a neighbor's backyard to get a basketball, and someone's first instinct is calling the police." Margaret, with his arms crossed and his fists tight, turned quickly, trying to disguise the growing anger. The unbelief was on his face, but the truth, heavier than any accusation, was now evident. She had made a serious mistake. "I didn't know who he was," Margaret said, his laden voice, trying to justify his actions. "He could be anyone. And children like him, they don't stop by invading gardens for no reason." Monique's tone has not changed. She kept her posture, but the following words fell like a sharp blade. "Children like him?" she repeated, her voice now almost a threatening whisper. "What exactly does that mean?" The tension on the street has become dense, like a dark cloud about to collapse. The neighbors, who once watched in silence, now exchanged stealthy glances. What once seemed to be a simple accusation had become something larger, deeper. and Monique's words seemed to resonate on the walls of the houses around, reverberating a discomfort that no one could ignore. Margaret, who had previously been so confident, now seemed to falter. Her posture stiffened, and she tried to back down, but her voice already betrayed her nervousness. "I just thought that he was doing something wrong, and when I saw, the best I could do was call the police." Monique stepped forward. His gaze did not deviate from Margaret, but now there was a different weight in his voice. She spoke calmly, but the authority was undeniable. "Let me clarify one thing," she said, every word being a reminder of the difference between the two. "You didn't call the police to protect a house. You called the police to a 12-year-old just because he was taking his ball, and without even thinking twice, you decided that he was suspicious, that he did or stopped doing it." The crowd, hitherto quietly, seemed to absorb each word as if they were watching a revelation. Jalen, in silence, felt the shame eroded his confidence, although he knew that everything he did was try to play with his ball. But now, in the face of the governor and the looks of the community, he was no longer just a child. He was the symbol of a much larger story. Monique didn't take her eyes from Margaret. She didn't shouted, did not do exaggerated gestures. His presence alone was enough to undermine any attempt to dodge the focus of the truth. "You need to understand," she continued, her voice now lower, but loaded with an intensity that could not be ignored. "It's not just about my son. These are all children who are afraid of leaving home because they know that the color of your skin will make them seen as a threat instead of a promise." She paused, allowing her words to nod, and then turned to the police, her eyes shining with determination. "I want this to be resolved now, the right way. My son doesn't deserve to be treated like that, and no one else should be." The police, once hesitantly, were now visibly more comfortable with the situation, understanding that the pressure they felt did not come from the governor but from a system that needed to be questioned. Margaret, feeling the weight of shame, looked to the floor and finally said with a broken voice, "Sorry, Governor Carter." Monique then went to the crowd, his tone changing a relentless requirement to a speech that resonated with all the people present there. "This is not just about my son," she said, now speaking not as a policy, but as a mother. "It's about all children who have been forced to believe they don't belong. It's about all parents who stay at night, asking if their children will come home safely without anyone judging them for their appearance." The faces in the crowd transformed. Some were embarrassed, some bothered, and others simply aware of the depth of the situation. Prejudice was not only in one act, but in the seed that was planted and cultivated over time. Monique looked at Jalen one last time before gesturing him approaching. She put her hand on her shoulder and with a soft smile said, "It's all right, son. The world will see you for who you really are, and we'll fight for it to happen." The crowd, now in silence, felt that this moment had touched something deep, something that would go beyond the incident of a boy trying to get a ball. It was the beginning of a collective reflection, a call to rethink the way they saw the other, the importance of looking at others as human beings first of all. Monique's words were simple, but they carried a huge weight. She didn't just speak as a governor or mother, but as a voice for the future. "We all have the responsibility to guarantee a world where our children, our neighbors, all feel safe and valued," she said, looking at each face in the crowd. "Safety is not just about closed walls or doors. It's about the dignity we offer one another." She turned to Margaret once again. His voice now was calm, of someone who did not need to scream to be heard, but whose words were an indisputable promise. "Think well before making assumptions like this again. Next time, the consequences will be deeper than you can imagine." Margaret, who had once been so arrogant, was now visibly shaken. His face lost his color, and his eyes, which were once full of confidence, were now full of shame. There was no more space for bravata. It was the recognition of error, something that could no longer be ignored. But for Monique, this was not just about correcting an injustice at that time. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The struggle was not about a single incident. It was about a silent but strong movement to change a mindset that was rooted in fear and unfounded assumptions. And this change needed to start there on that street in that neighborhood. The neighbors watched in silence. the impact of the situation becoming evident on their faces. They, who may not have questioned their own beliefs before, have now been facing something they could not ignore. Margaret Whitmore, who was always an authority figure, was now isolated. Each look toward him carried the weight of the shame she had built herself. Monique, with the clarity of who knows what needs to be done, contacted the local community association. She didn't just want the incident to be discussed, she wanted real changes. He proposed a series of workshops and meetings about prejudice, empathy, and the importance of seeing people beyond their appearances. For her, it was essential to ensure that community members understood that the problem was not just Jalen, but with all the Jalen out there being invisible in their experiences. Jalen, in turn, found strength in his own pain. The experience of being tried without reason made him marks, but also gave him a voice. At a school meeting, he stood up before his colleagues and spoke with a sincerity that played all present. "I didn't understand what happened. I didn't understand why someone would think I was dangerous just by the way I seemed," he said, the sadness and confusion still present in his tone. "But now, I know we need to face it. We need to be better with each other." What had started with a basketball ball rolling to the wrong backyard turned into something much deeper. It was a moment of confrontation, not only with Margaret's action, but with the way the whole community saw the other. Jalen, unknowingly, had triggered a reflection on what meant being part of a place, a world that until then looked at him differently. Margaret Whitmore, over the days, saw his influence decrease. The shame of what she had done would not leave her easily. She knew that regardless of how much she tried to justify her actions, something within her soul had changed, and that was not something that time could erase. Monique, in turn, never stopped fighting. She continued to use her position to give voice to the invisible, to challenge the structures that created walls among people. She was not just being a governor, but a mother, a neighbor, a leader who knew the world would only change when everyone was seen, heard, and respected, no matter what the appearance said. And that story, which could have just been another page turned, became the symbol of something much bigger. It was about the power of truth, the courage to question the assumptions that shape our actions, and the hope that one day we will all be able to build a world where each of us really belongs. If you like this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Here you will find exciting stories every day made to touch the heart. And I'm sure the story that is appearing on the screen now will thrill you too. Don't miss it.